So welcome to day 2 of AP Computer Science and Data Structures, Unit 8, Constructors, Super, and This. So today we're going to have a short lecture about constructors and the super and this constructs that you can use within it. And then you're going to have a short assignment where you're tracing constructor calls and trying to figure out the order of execution that's happening. As a reminder, you should obtain a copy of the Barron's AP Computer Science Study Guide, 9th edition. If you get the 8th edition, that's okay. There's a little bit more actually in the 8th edition than 9th edition. They've removed a couple topics from the test, but we're doing all those topics in this class, so it won't hurt to have the 8th edition. But you might as well get the 9th edition if you can. It's about $17 on Amazon. If money is an issue, talk to me and we can get a copy for you. Please get it by next Friday because we'll be using it some in class. Okay, so first of all, there's just some key understandings. We've used constructors before. A constructor is something that's automatically run whenever an object is instantiated. Whenever a new copy is created, the constructor automatically runs. And the constructor is a special method that always shares the name of the class and doesn't have a return type. Those should be things that we're familiar with. Something that might be less familiar is the first line of every constructor must call the superclass constructor or another constructor in the same class. And we're going to be talking about this kind of most of the rest of this lecture. And if the constructor does not begin with a call to super or this, then the compiler automatically adds a no-arg call to super. And if the superclass doesn't have a no-arg constructor, then your code won't compile. So here's an example. We have this base object, and it has a constructor that takes an int apple. It does not have a no-arg constructor. In here, since base object extends object, that's implied because we don't have the word extends here, so it's going to be extending the root object class. We are going to call, the compiler will automatically put in a super without arguments, and that will automatically call the no-arg constructor of object. Now let's say we extended this class with this new class, does not compile. Now again, we did not put in a call to super in here, so the compiler is going to try to put in a super. But when it tries to, it's like, hey, base object doesn't have a constructor that takes no arguments because the constructor here takes one argument. So this won't compile. You can try it in IntelliJ and you'll get a little red line that says that there is no arg constructor. The correct way to write this would be in the constructor down here. So now we called it has a super. We would put super, and that would then refer to the superclass constructor, and we pass in a single argument. So super is always referring to the superclass constructor if it's an open close paren, and so then we can put in the number of arguments we want to pass up to that superclass. So this is an explicit call that we put in this time. All classes, of course, always have a constructor, but you don't necessarily need to put one in your code, and if you don't put one in, the compiler will create one by default. Now we typically just always create it as a matter of course, but if we don't put one in, the compiler will create one for us. So for example, let's say we create this no constructor class, a nice simple class that just has a variable a and has a toString. We did not put in a constructor, so when we compile it, the compiler behind the scenes will create a no-arg constructor for us. And that constructor will just have one line where it calls the superclass no-arg constructor. So that will all be done for us. Now, the next item is that if you put two constructors in a class, one constructor can actually call the other constructor. And we're going to use the word this in order to accomplish this. And just as a side point, you can only use super or this to call a constructor as the first line in the constructor. And again, if you don't have either of them in there, the compiler will automatically put in a call to the no-arg superclass constructor. So here's an example where we have two constructors in a class. So the first constructor is shown here, and it takes two arguments. It takes an a and a b, and it just sets some internal variables, some instance variables. So now if we want to add in a second constructor that takes no arguments, so the two constructors have to take different numbers of arguments, or at least different types of arguments. So this one takes no arguments, and we want to call the first constructor with two values, 5 and 7. So we could say this 5, 7, and they would call it up here and set them up accordingly. So there you go. So we've talked about how constructors are always called when the object is created, and we've talked about how we need to always call super or this when we create our as the first line of our constructor, and if we don't put either of those in there, then an automatic superclass call to superclass no-arg constructor is inserted for us. So now you have an assignment. It's in Schoology, so you can open the PDF. That's 2 pages. On the front, it has some sample code, and then on the back, you're supposed to input what the output will be. Now, it's a little confusing at first to try to figure out what it's asking, but work through it. You can ask questions of me or your classmates. You're allowed to compare answers with your classmates, but I would ask that each of you try each question individually, and then you can kind of get help from each other or from me. I will be available on the chat room or via email. Feel free to connect with me either way. And then later today, after everybody submits the homework, I will share solutions so you can check your work. Very good. Take care.